Sometimes the silence tells you more than any scream ever could. It was just after sunrise on a warm morning in June of 1945 when 9-year-old Evelyn Carter stepped off the front porch of her family's farm in Eminence, Missouri, and walked straight into the trees. She was humming to herself, holding a wicker basket in one hand and wearing her red scarf tied snug around her neck. That scarf was her favorite. Her mother Ruth had ironed it the night before and left it folded on the dresser. Evelyn said she was going to the orchard to look for apples. It was a routine so ordinary that no one thought to worry. The orchard was only a few minutes past the pasture, and she had made the trip dozens of times. But something was different that morning. The wind was too still. The dogs never barked. And Ruth Carter, distracted at the sink, only looked up once. She saw her daughter's small figure disappearing behind the fence. She turned away to rinse the milk jars. It was the last time she would ever see Evelyn alive. The day grew long and hot. By noon, Ruth stood on the porch calling Evelyn's name into the trees. No reply. Samuel Carter searched the orchard, then the barn, then the creek. The neighbors were called. By late afternoon, the entire hill was crawling with volunteers, their boots tracking over brush and mud. They searched every inch of the woods, but Evelyn had left no trail behind. Not a footprint, not a snapped branch, not a dropped ribbon. Just one strange detail. The red scarf she wore that morning was back on the porch by evening, folded neatly on the top step. It had no dirt on it, no tears, no blood, as if someone had placed it there with clean hands and walked away without a sound. Ruth held it to her chest, trembling. It made no sense. If Evelyn had come back, why would she leave the scarf behind and not come inside? If someone else had brought it, why leave it folded so gently? Mrs. Jennings, the elderly neighbor who lived past the creek, said she saw something unusual that morning. She had looked out her window just before noon and spotted a car parked near the woods behind the Carter barn. It was a black 1941 Packard sedan, shiny and out of place on the muddy back road. No one in Eminence owned a car like that. The rain came just hours later. When Sheriff Clyde Halter arrived the next day to check the scene, there were no tire tracks, no signs of where the car had gone. Halter was a man who believed in hard evidence, and without any, he concluded the sighting was unreliable. He walked the property, asked a few short questions, then lit a cigarette, and left a report that would soon be forgotten. He told Ruth and Samuel that Evelyn likely wandered too far and got lost. But Ruth knew better. Evelyn was frightened of the woods. She never went beyond the orchard and never alone for long. Within 2 days, the official search ended. Sheriff Halter posted a notice at the courthouse and filed the report. That was all. The family was left alone with their grief and their questions. Samuel went quiet. Ruth stopped sleeping. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with the scarf in her hands, her eyes fixed on the window as if waiting for a sound that never came. The orchard grew darker in her mind, a place no longer filled with apples but with something colder, more cruel. Townspeople began to whisper. Some said Evelyn had run away. Others said something worse had happened. A few recalled seeing Samuel behind the barn late that same evening, tossing something into the fire barrel. One neighbor claimed the smoke smelled like cloth. Another said it smelled like burning hair. But no one pressed the issue. There was no proof, and no one wanted to look too closely at a grieving father. By the end of summer, Evelyn's name had vanished from the town's daily talk. School started again. The crops came in. Life pressed forward. But the Carter home stayed frozen in the moment she disappeared. Her bedroom remained untouched. Her toys lined the window. Her chair stayed pulled out at the table. Ruth never left the house except to stand on the porch and stare into the woods. Every day she replayed the same question. Why would someone return the scarf? What message were they sending? It was not discarded. It was placed, carefully, intentionally. Ruth believed it meant Evelyn had made it home, that she had reached the porch, that something or someone stopped her before she could open the door. That single act, folding the scarf, haunted her more than any nightmare. It was not just a loss. It was a message, and it would take 33 years for the truth behind it to finally come to light. The second day brought a steady drizzle that soaked the Carter property and turned every dirt path into soft clay. Ruth Carter stood barefoot on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, her dress damp from the rain. Samuel sat at the edge of the barn in silence, his boots streaked with mud, his eyes fixed on the orchard, as if expecting Evelyn to walk out from between the trees. Sheriff Clyde Halter returned mid-morning in his county vehicle and stepped out with a clipboard in hand. His face was unreadable. He had brought no dogs, he had brought no backup. He asked the same questions he had asked the day before and wrote down the same vague answers. Ruth told him again about the scarf. Samuel said nothing. A few neighbors lingered near the gate, unsure if they should leave or stay. Halter looked at them, then looked at the ground. He called off the official search that afternoon and announced that no credible leads had been found. The news spread quickly. By dusk, most of the volunteers had packed up their lanterns and gone home, leaving behind boot prints and trampled weeds, but no real answers. Ruth's body trembled when she heard the words come out of the sheriff's mouth. No credible leads. As if the scarf had folded itself. As if the black car seen behind the barn was just imagination. She tried to speak, but her throat locked tight. Sheriff Halter handed her a copy of the report and told her to keep an eye out for anything new. Then he climbed back into his car and left. That night the rain let up briefly, and the air turned cold. The neighbors had gone, but one of them passed by on horseback near twilight and noticed something behind the Carter barn. A soft orange glow flickered in the corner of the yard. Samuel was standing near a barrel, tossing something into the flames. The neighbor said the smoke had a strange smell, like burnt cloth, and something else he could not quite name. He watched for a moment, then rode on without saying a word. He never reported it until years later. But he never forgot the scent or the look on Samuel's face, a blank stare lit by fire. The following morning the farm was still. Ruth stayed in her room, the scarf pressed against her chest, her eyes swollen from crying. Samuel went to the shed and did not come out until noon. The town of Eminence moved on with cautious steps. No new signs were posted. No meetings were held. No headlines appeared in the local paper. A few people asked quiet questions, but most stopped bringing it up. Sheriff Halter returned to his normal duties. He resolved a dispute between two cattlemen. He wrote a fine for a broken fence. He never returned to the Carter property again. Ruth began to notice the absence of people more than their presence. Friends who once stopped by with pie now left baskets on the step and walked away without knocking. Church ladies dropped off casseroles and kept their eyes low. She understood what they were not saying. In small towns, silence becomes a kind of answer, and when there are no new questions, people stop looking for new truths. Over the next week, Ruth began to feel the walls of her home closing in. The familiar became foreign. The apple orchard turned to shadow. The barn seemed too quiet. The front porch where Evelyn used to sit and braid her doll's hair became a monument to a memory. Samuel spent more time outdoors fixing fences that were not broken, moving tools from one place to another. He spoke little and slept even less. One night Ruth found him standing in the orchard, barefoot, staring at the trees with the rain falling all around him. She called out, but he did not turn. She went back inside alone. Each day grew heavier than the last. The unanswered questions settled into their bones. Ruth tried to hold on to what she knew was true. Evelyn did not run away. Evelyn did not lose her way in the woods. Evelyn did not fold that scarf herself and place it on the step. Someone else had touched it. Someone else had stood on their porch. That knowledge wrapped around her heart like a cold rope. The town's attention shifted. A new baby was born. A storm knocked over a grain silo. A dog won a ribbon at the county fair. And Evelyn Carter's name became something you said in passing or not at all. The sheriff did not reopen the case. The volunteers did not return. Ruth found herself memorizing every sound the house made, every creak in the floorboards, every rattle of the window pane. She tried to remember if she had heard something strange that morning. A knock, a footstep, a car door closing, but her memory offered no gifts, only gaps, only silence. She sat in Evelyn's room with the scarf on her lap, watching dust float through the sunbeam that fell across the dresser. She waited for something to come back to her. A whisper, a shape, a sign. But nothing ever came. By autumn of that same year, the Carter farm felt like a house suspended in time. Ruth moved through the days like a sleepwalker, folding laundry that no one wore, setting the table for 3 instead of 2, brushing dust from Evelyn's dresser, as if her daughter might walk back in and complain about it. The scarf remained on Ruth's nightstand untouched, except when she laid it flat, and traced its seams with her fingertips. Outside, the leaves began to fall, blanketing the fields in orange and gold, but inside the house there was only gray. Samuel stopped shaving. He spent long stretches in the barn, hammering boards that did not need fixing oiling tools that already gleamed. He did not speak of the night he stood in the orchard, soaked in rain. Ruth no longer asked. Their grief had become separate rooms, both locked from the inside. Some nights Ruth lit a lamp and stood by the window for hours, staring at the dark. She sometimes whispered Evelyn's name just to hear it again. But the wind only answered with its hollow breath. And still the house held its secrets, and Evelyn did not return. 6 months passed, and Ruth disappeared just as quietly as her daughter had. One morning, Samuel woke to find her side of the bed empty and the front door ajar. Her purse sat untouched by the coat rack. Her shoes remained neatly tucked beside the mat. Only her wedding ring was missing. It had been resting on the edge of the bathroom sink the night before, beside the folded hand towel she always used to dry her face. Samuel stood in the hallway for a long time, holding the ring in his hand before placing it gently on the windowsill. He did not tell anyone she was gone for several days. He simply worked the farm alone and avoided town. When someone finally asked, he said she had gone to visit her cousin in Springfield. No one questioned it. People in town had stopped asking about the Carters. They had stopped wondering what went on inside that house. The curtains stayed drawn. The lights stayed low. And now the woman who used to stand at the porch every evening was gone too. Years passed without change. By the early 50s, the Carter farm had become a hollow shell of what it once was. The orchard overgrew with weeds and brambles. The chicken coop collapsed under snow one winter and was never rebuilt. Samuel sold off the dairy cows and took to sleeping in the barn some nights. The farmhouse smelled of dust and oil. The wind moved through it like it belonged there more than anyone else. Evelyn's room stayed untouched. Her shoes remained lined against the wall. Her schoolbooks were stacked neatly beside her bed, the top one open to a page she had never finished. Samuel never locked the door. He would sometimes sit in the room as if waiting for her to come back and finish the chapter. He stopped fixing things that broke. He stopped harvesting the apples. He let the fences sag and the paint peel. He kept the scarf into the drawer beside his bed, though he never opened it again. In 1951, a boy from the neighboring farm wandered into the abandoned chicken coop, looking for a place to hide during a game of tag. He stepped over cracked boards and rusted wire, and found a torn sheet of paper wedged under a broken feeding trough. It had faded ink and faint lines of writing in a child's hand. He took it to his mother, who recognized the handwriting right away. It was Evelyn's. The words were shaky half-sentences scribbled in pencil, but one line stood out. It read, "I do not like when he watches me," and was signed with a simple E at the bottom. The woman gave the paper to her husband, who walked it straight to the sheriff. Halter read it once, folded it twice, and tucked it into his coat without a word. He told the man that the paper looked too old to mean anything now. He said the boy probably found it buried with trash. He said rumors had already caused too much trouble. No investigation followed. The paper disappeared. By the end of that year, the Carter name was rarely spoken. Ruth's cousin claimed she had never heard from her. Samuel no longer visited the feed store. He sent notes with hired boys and left cash in an envelope on the porch. He aged faster than the seasons. His beard grew wild. His hands grew thin. He became a figure seen only at a distance, walking his field in circles, like a man lost inside his own memories. The orchard bore fruit, but no one picked it. The wind tore down shingles, but no one repaired them. The town of Eminence kept moving. A new family opened a diner. The The school got electric lights, but up the gravel road the Carter farm stood untouched, quiet, waiting, as if it too was holding its breath. In the summer of 1977, the hills around Eminence had grown quieter, but no less dense. The orchard behind the Carter place still stood, though most of the trees had stopped producing. Weeds curled over what used to be garden rows, and the fence posts leaned in tired slants. The farmhouse sagged under the weight of time, its paint nearly gone, its porch half sunken. Few people gave it more than a passing glance anymore. That changed when a stranger came walking down the road one dusty afternoon. His name was Eli Morgan, and he had not been seen in Shannon County for more than 30 years. He was older now, face drawn by sun and age, with a cane in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. Eli had once worked for Samuel Carter back when the farm had chickens and laughter. He had left not long after Evelyn disappeared and never came back. Some thought he had died out west. Others forgot him completely. But now he was here again, and he carried something more than story. He had a memory, one he had kept locked away, and one that was ready to be spoken. Eli sat on the bench outside the diner for a full hour before anyone recognized him. A mechanic named Frank Talbot, who had once been a boy sneaking peaches from the Carter orchard, remembered the tilt of Eli's walk and the knot on his hand from an old barn accident. They talked for a while, and then Frank drove him to the county paper's office. Eli asked to speak to someone who would listen without rolling their eyes. He told them he had worked on the Carter farm in 1945, and that he had seen something the day Evelyn vanished. He said he had been behind the barn repairing a water trough when he heard a girl's voice cry out. He said he walked toward the sound and saw Evelyn near the edge of the orchard, standing still with her back to him. She looked frightened but unharmed. Before he could reach her, someone else came out from the trees. Eli would not say who. He only said he saw her turn toward that person and take a step forward. Then she was gone. He never saw her again. The story stirred something in the town. People who had long stopped caring found themselves lingering at the diner, asking if anyone had read the article. It ran on the third page of the Eminence Weekly, with a small photo of Eli Morgan and a single line pulled in bold. "I saw her. She was breathing. The sheriff's office said there was nothing they could do. The case was still closed. No body had ever been found. No new evidence had surfaced." But the article traveled anyway. Loretta Barnes, a teacher new to the town and curious about the orchard house she passed every morning, clipped the story and kept it on her desk. That same week, something else was uncovered. A man named Will Granger had bought the Carter property and begun renovations to the old barn, hoping to use the land for livestock. While tearing up the floorboards near the hayloft, he struck something hard and wedged between two beams. It was a small metal object wedged in dust and spider webs. Will reached down and pulled the object loose. It was a schoolgirl's locket, tarnished, and bent, the chain knotted with dirt. He opened it with a screwdriver. Inside was a scorched photo of a young girl in a school dress, her hair pulled back, her face slightly turned. Though damaged, it was clear enough for Will's wife to gasp when she saw it. The initials EC were etched on the back in faint script. Word of the find reached the town by sundown. The locket was taken to the sheriff's office and placed in a drawer marked unclaimed property. Sheriff Dalton, the son of a man who had once worked under Halter, said he would look into it, but could not promise anything would come of it. No testing was done. No follow-up occurred. But those who had grown up with the story of Evelyn Carter knew what the locket meant. It had waited under the floorboards for more than 30 years, silent and sealed in wood. And now it had surfaced. Eli Morgan returned to the Carter property one last time that week. He stood at the edge of the orchard and looked at the trees, some of them still bearing fruit. He walked the fence line slowly, his cane tapping soft rhythms into the dry earth. He did not speak. When he reached the barn, he sat on the stone step and placed his hand on the wood, as if trying to feel something beneath the surface. He stayed there until sunset, then nodded to himself and walked away without turning back. He left town 2 days later and was never seen again. But for those who believed his words, and those who held the locket in their hands, something had changed. The past no longer felt quite so buried. The story was beginning to breathe again. Loretta Barnes had only been in Eminence for 4 months when she read the article about Evelyn Carter. She had come from Jefferson City to take a job teaching 4th grade at the local elementary school. She was 32, single, and had a curious mind that did not sit well with half answers. On her 2nd week in town, she passed the old Carter house and felt something tug at her. She did not know the full story, then only whispers passed around the teacher's lounge about a missing girl and a family that had crumbled. After reading the article about Eli Morgan's return and the locket found in the barn, Loretta could not let it go. She asked questions during staff lunches and scanned back issues of the paper at the library. The more she learned, the heavier the story became. She began to feel it while walking the school halls, as if Evelyn's absence still lived in the corners. One afternoon after dismissal, she climbed into the attic above the old section of the school. No one had used it in years. Dust coated every surface. She opened a storage trunk and found a box labeled Drawings 1945 to 1950. She carried the box down carefully and opened it on her desk. Inside were dozens of drawings faded with time, some crumpled at the corners. They were the kind of things children made for art class. Houses with chimneys, trees with apples, people holding hands. Most were unsigned or scrawled with messy initials. But near the bottom, Loretta found one that made her pause. It was a sketch of a barn, drawn in simple lines but with remarkable detail. The roof sagged slightly on one side. The door had a broken hinge. There were apples on the ground beside it. At the bottom corner was a small signature. E.C. The date read April 1946. Loretta blinked. That was nearly a year after Evelyn had disappeared. She held the paper up to the light, as if that might explain it. She showed it to the principal the next day, but he only shrugged and said old papers had a way of getting mixed up. Loretta disagreed. She had a feeling this drawing was not misplaced. It had been waiting. That same week, something else happened that kept Loretta up at night. A boy in her class named Caleb Dawson had drawn a picture for an assignment about places in town. He handed it to her with a smile. When she unfolded the sheet, her hands went still. Caleb had drawn a barn nearly identical to the one in the drawing from the attic. It had the same slanted roof, the same broken door. There were trees behind it, thick with apples. She asked him where he had seen it. He said his grandfather pointed it out once on a walk and told him not to go near it. He said it used to be part of a haunted farm. Loretta pressed him gently, but the boy did not know more. She drove out to the Carter property that evening and stood at the edge of the field. The barn had been torn down, but the foundation still remained. She looked at the stones and tried to match them to the drawing. She could see the layout clearly in her mind. Her breath caught. She knew the details too well. The next morning, Loretta returned to the attic with a flashlight and a notepad. She searched every box, every drawer. Most were filled with supplies and faded report cards, but then she found a folder with the name Carter scrawled across the top. Inside were 2 essays and a spelling test dated February 1945. The handwriting matched the journal page found years ago in the chicken coop. The essays were simple. One was about Evelyn's favorite book. The other described her favorite place, which she called the Orchard House. Loretta sat down slowly. It was not just the details. It was the voice. A child trying to make sense of something too big. The orchard was where she felt safe. The trees were her friends. Loretta circled the lines in pencil and read them again. She imagined Evelyn writing them at this very desk, small hands gripping the pencil, trying to stay within the lines. She wondered if Evelyn knew then what was coming. If she had already seen something that frightened her. If she had already been watched. Loretta took everything she found and made copies. She wrote down questions. She created a timeline. She went back to the Carter property on her own and walked its edges with a small camera in her pocket. No one stopped her. No one seemed to care anymore. But she cared. She could not let it rest. The more she uncovered, the more she felt Evelyn's voice rising from the quiet. A whisper in paper. A shape in pencil? A truth buried too long? Loretta stood at the old foundation and looked into the weeds growing up between the cracks. Somewhere below all of this, she believed something still waited to be found. In early spring of 1978, a rancher named Walter Griggs bought the Carter property with plans to clear the orchard and expand pasture for his growing herd. Walter had grown up 3 counties over and had only heard bits of the Evelyn Carter story. He believed in cattle and fences, not ghost tales. The barn had been gone for decades, but its stone foundation still cut across the center of the field. Walter hired a local crew to remove the remaining stones and dig post holes for a new perimeter. The first few days went without trouble. Then, one morning, as a backhoe dragged a tangle of roots from the southern edge of the site, the machine struck something hollow. The operator stopped immediately. Walter walked over and kicked at the soil with his boot. The shape beneath looked like a slab of rock, covering a dark space. It took them 3 hours to uncover it completely. Beneath the foundation stones and tangled roots was a square entry framed with rotted timbers leading down into a chamber. None of the crew had known it existed. There had been no mention of a cellar in any records. It was sealed by time and silence. The opening was small, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The air that drifted out smelled of old earth and something metallic. Walter climbed down first with a flashlight while 2 of the workers stood above, watching nervously. The cellar was no more than 10 feet by 10 feet, its walls made of stacked stone and clay. Rusted shelves lined one wall. An overturned wooden crate lay in the corner. Dust covered everything. Spiderwebs thickened the air. Walter swept his light across the floor and saw nothing at first. But near the far wall, half buried in soil and decayed leaves, something red caught the beam. He moved closer, crouched down, and reached into the debris. It was a scrap of fabric. The red had dulled with age, but still held color. The edges were frayed and torn. Tangled in the cloth was a thin metal object. He wiped it clean with his shirt. It was a hairpin, simple in design, bent slightly at the stem. Walter held it up and stared. Something about the way it had been wrapped in the cloth struck him as deliberate. He climbed out of the cellar with the items and placed them on the back of his truck bed. The cloth was too small to be part of a dress, more likely a scarf or sash. One of the older crew members looked at it and turned pale. He said nothing at first, then asked Walter where exactly he had found it. When Walter pointed to the cellar, the man shook his head and said he remembered the story of a missing girl who wore a red scarf. He had been a teenager then, and remembered the porch, the mother crying, and the sheriff driving away too soon. The man said he never forgot the way folks stopped talking about it before the questions were answered. Walter did not say much. He packed the fabric and the hairpin into a lunch tin and said he would take it to the sheriff's office in the morning. He did not sleep well that night. The house he was building on the far end of the property felt colder. The walls creaked more than usual. Outside, the orchard branches scratched the windows all night long. Sheriff Dalton examined the contents the next day with a cautious eye. He took down the statement but offered no promises. He said the cellar would be checked, but it was unlikely to lead to anything new. The office was quiet. Loretta Barnes heard about the discovery from the librarian who had heard it from the woman at the feed store. She drove out that afternoon and asked to see the site. Walter hesitated, but allowed it. Loretta stood at the edge of the cellar and stared down. Her hand gripped the edge of the wood frame. She did not speak for several minutes. She asked Walter if he had touched anything else. He said no. She nodded and turned to look out at the orchard. She said it felt like a grave, even though there were no bones. Walter agreed. There was something about the quiet. The cellar had waited a long time, and now it had given up its secret, even if no one was sure what it meant. Loretta went home and opened the file she had started. She wrote down 2 new words: hairpin, fabric. She circled them twice. That evening she sat at her desk with the attic drawings beside her. She looked at the sketch Evelyn had made of the barn with its tilted roof and apple trees. Her eyes moved to the bottom corner where a small dark square had been drawn in shadow. A square just beneath the barn floor. Loretta had thought it was a mistake. Now she wondered if Evelyn had drawn the cellar without even realizing it, as if she had known it was there, or had been near it, or had been taken inside. She pulled the student drawing from her class as well, the one made by Caleb. His version of the barn showed no door, no windows, just walls and trees. But in the dirt below the barn, he had drawn a square. Loretta called his home that night and asked to speak to his grandfather. The phone call Loretta made that evening led her to a small nursing home, 10 miles from Eminence in the town of Winona. Caleb's grandfather, Pastor Nolan Dawson, agreed to meet with her after hearing what his grandson had drawn and how closely it matched the real barn foundation. He was in his 70s now, thin and tired, but sharp. He remembered the Carters well and said he had never believed Evelyn simply wandered off. He recalled stories told in whispers about something darker. Pastor Dawson directed Loretta to another woman in the nursing home, a former neighbor named Nora Jennings. Nora had been the one to report the black car behind the barn in 1945. She was 89 now, pale as paper, and in a hospital bed with machines ticking quietly around her. When Loretta stepped into the room, Nora turned her head slowly. Her eyes were faded, but alert. Loretta introduced herself and explained why she had come. Nora listened in silence and then asked everyone to leave the room except for Loretta. What she shared next had been buried longer than Evelyn had been missing. Nora said she had not spoken of that night in over 30 years. She believed it had haunted her because it had never been spoken aloud. On the evening Evelyn disappeared, Nora had been on her porch sewing by lantern light. She had a clear view across the creek to the back edge of the Carter property. She said the wind had carried sound easily that night. Around dusk, she saw movement near the orchard. She saw Samuel Carter walking with something slumped over his shoulder. She did not know what it was at first. It might have been a sack of feed. But then she saw a leg swing, small and limp. She rose to her feet, confused. He disappeared into the trees. Nora thought she should have called out, but her voice caught. She never saw him come back. That memory had never gone away. It stayed with her like a splinter in the mind. She had told no one. Until now. Then Nora paused. Her voice trembled as she spoke again. Later that night as the rain began, she heard a knock at her door. It was Ruth Carter. She was soaked to the bone, barefoot and shaking. Her hands were stained with something dark. Her dress was ripped at the hem. She kept saying one sentence over and over, "He made me choose. He made me choose." Nora tried to bring her inside, but Ruth backed away. She looked like she was breaking apart. Then she turned and ran back into the woods. Nora never told anyone. Not her husband, not the sheriff. She had convinced herself she imagined it. But hearing about the cellar and the cloth had shaken something loose. She said Ruth had been a woman who loved her child more than her own breath. And yet that night she had not brought Evelyn back. Nora's eyes filled with tears. She asked Loretta if she believed Ruth had tried to save her child, or if she had already lost her. Loretta did not answer. She could not. Loretta thanked her gently and stepped out of the room. She sat in her car for nearly an hour, trying to process what she had heard. The image of Samuel in the orchard and Ruth covered in blood kept circling through her thoughts. What did Ruth mean when she said he made me choose? Was it fear? Was it guilt? She began to see the pieces from the last few months as part of a pattern. The scarf on the porch, the hidden cellar, the folded paper in the chicken coop, the journal entry about being watched, the locket in the barn floor. All of it pointed toward something that had been kept quiet by more than just forgetfulness. Loretta opened her notebook and added a new page. She wrote Nora's name at the top. Below it she wrote 3 things. Samuel carrying something. Ruth with blood on her. He made me choose. Then she drew a box around it. The box was small, like the cellar. A place where things were hidden. The next morning, Loretta returned to the school and placed all of her documents into a binder. She labeled it Evelyn and left it in her locked desk drawer. She was not sure what to do next. The sheriff's office had taken the scarf and the pin, but never called back. The newspaper had not followed up on Eli's story. The town seemed content to let the past stay buried. But Loretta knew that something had cracked open. She felt it every time she passed the orchard, every time she stepped into Evelyn's old classroom. The story was no longer just about a girl who vanished. It was about choices made in silence. It was about a family swallowed by fear. That afternoon, Loretta drove back to the nursing home to check on Nora. But the nurse at the front desk said Nora had passed away in her sleep just hours after their conversation. Loretta stood still for a long moment, then quietly asked if she had left anything behind. The nurse handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. It said, "I am sorry I waited this long." The rest of it was blank. After Nora's death, Loretta found herself gripped by a deeper sense of urgency. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about truth. Evelyn's story had grown larger than a single event. It had become a web of overlooked clues and people too afraid to speak. Loretta decided to revisit the Carter house one more time. The property had been boarded up by the county after years of decay and complaints from neighbors. The porch sagged and vines curled through the window frames. Paint peeled from the wood like flaking skin. Loretta stood at the steps for several minutes before entering. She moved through the rooms carefully, flashlight in hand, her shoes crunching on old glass and dry leaves. Evelyn's bedroom was still intact, though faded. The wallpaper had curled at the edges. The bed frame leaned. The dresser drawer was stuck, but she pried it open. Inside were pencils, marbles, a small silver button. Then she tapped along the wall, listening for difference in sound. Her knuckles rapped against one panel near the baseboard that echoed slightly. She pressed her palm flat against it and pushed. It gave way with a dry crack. Behind it was a hollow space. Inside the gap was a small tin box, rusted and cold. Loretta sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it slowly. Inside were 8 letters, all unopened, their edges curled with time. Each was addressed in careful script to Evelyn Carter and postmarked from St. Louis. The dates ranged from 1952 to 1963. Loretta felt the air grow still as she turned the envelopes over one by one. All had the same return address. The name listed was Margaret R. Whitlow. She carefully opened the first letter. It was short, a simple greeting followed by a sentence asking why Evelyn had not written back. Margaret hoped she was safe and missed her terribly. The handwriting was firm but tender. Loretta opened the next few in sequence. Each expressed concern. Each asked why Evelyn had stopped replying. Then the 6th letter stopped her breath. It mentioned a man named Sheriff Halter and warned Evelyn to keep her head down if he ever returned to town. Margaret said she should never use her real name again. Loretta felt her fingers go numb. She opened the 7th letter, which had a small photograph tucked inside. It was black and white, slightly faded, showing a young girl standing in front of a fountain in what looked like Forest Park in downtown St. Louis. The girl wore a plain dress and smiled softly. Her hair was pulled back like Evelyn's had been in the school photo. Loretta held the photo up to the light and compared it to the drawing Evelyn had done of her orchard. The resemblance was striking. The final letter, dated 1963, was shorter than the rest. It said Margaret had moved to a new apartment and was worried Evelyn would not find her again. There was a line scribbled near the bottom. If you ever need to run, use the name Anna Ruth. The signature was rushed, as if written in fear. Loretta packed the letters back into the box and placed it into her bag. She walked through the house one last time before stepping out into the fading light. The wind moved through the trees like a whisper. She felt Evelyn closer than ever before. At home, Loretta laid everything out on her kitchen table. The scarf, the drawing, the student sketch, the attic journal page, the letters, the photo. She began piecing the timeline together. The letters proved someone had known Evelyn survived past 1945. They placed her in St. Louis less than a decade after she vanished. Someone had helped her escape. Someone had warned her to disappear. And whoever Margaret Whitlow was, she had played a crucial role in hiding Evelyn from whoever had threatened her in Eminence. Loretta circled the name Halter in her notebook several times. The same man who had shut down the case in 2 days. The same man who ignored the locket and the scarf. The sheriff who claimed there were no leads. She thought about Nora's words. He made me choose. Loretta now believed Ruth had known Evelyn was not safe. She had made a choice that night to save her daughter in the only way she could, by sending her away and cutting all ties. Loretta wrote one word in large letters across her next page. Cover-up. The next day, Loretta drove to the courthouse to find public records on Margaret R. Whitlow. The clerk helped her dig through the archives. There were utility bills, lease agreements, and a rental document for a small apartment on the south side of St. Louis in 1954. Margaret had listed one dependent, female, age unknown. No school records were found. No medical records. In 1963, Margaret had moved again and never listed another dependent. She died in 1972 from heart failure, listed with no known next of kin. Loretta sat in her car afterward, staring at the courthouse steps. The window of time had closed. But she had the letters, she had the handwriting, and she had the photo. She decided to drive to the address listed on the back of the last envelope. It was a narrow brick house in a run-down neighborhood. An elderly woman next door remembered Margaret. She said a little girl had lived there with her for a few years. Quiet girl. Smart. She used to sit on the stoop with a notebook. Then one day both were gone. 2 weeks after her visit to St. Louis, Loretta returned to Eminence carrying a truth too heavy to keep to herself. She now believed that Evelyn Carter had not only survived, but had been deliberately hidden under a new identity. The evidence was clear, but it still lacked the one thing that would make the story undeniable. A body had never been found. Without that, the mystery remained officially unsolved, just rumor and speculation. Loretta sat at the edge of the orchard one evening with her notebook and stared out across the field. The trees had begun to flower again, the branches soft with white blooms. She thought of Ruth walking out here alone in the dark, hands shaking, heart racing. She thought of Samuel dragging something into the trees. She thought of Evelyn crouched somewhere in the silence waiting for her mother to make a choice. Then she remembered the collapsed stone wall near the north end of the orchard. It had once bordered the edge of the Carter property. Most people thought it had no significance. Loretta decided to walk there the next morning. She could not explain why. It was just a feeling. A tug that would not go away. The wall had fallen decades ago, its stones scattered through grass and brush. Loretta stepped carefully, parting vines and weeds, her boots sinking into soft earth. She found a patch that looked different. The ground there was sunken slightly, a dip no wider than a child's grave. The soil had a different texture, darker, more compressed. She knelt and brushed away the top layer. Beneath the leaves and moss was a piece of rotted fabric. Her stomach turned. She kept digging, hands, trembling, heart pounding in her chest. A few inches deeper, she struck something solid. It was not bone. It was a small box, rusted shut and wrapped in a disintegrating cloth. She pulled it free and opened the lid. Inside was a folded note, and something that looked like a dress, faded and torn. The note was written in a child's hand. It said, "Do not wait for me, I am not dead," and was signed simply with the letter E. Loretta sat back on her heels, shaking. It was not a grave. It had been made to look like one. It had been meant to fool someone. She brought the items to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dalton examined them, but offered no formal investigation. He said the dress could not be proven to be Evelyn's. He said the note could have been faked. He said no bones had been found. Loretta asked if that meant a child needed to die to be believed. He did not answer. She left the office angry, but more certain than ever. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it seem like Evelyn was buried in the orchard. Someone had wanted to close the chapter without closing the story. She thought again of the journal page found in the coop, the drawing in the attic, the scarf on the porch. Each item had been a whisper, a quiet resistance. Now, the box confirmed it. Evelyn had left on purpose. Whether she had been led or had fled, she had not been taken by force. She had been part of the plan, or at least she had understood enough to leave a message. Do not wait for me. I am not dead. Loretta could not forget those words. They echoed with weight and defiance. Later that week, she returned to the orchard and stood in the same place where she found the box. She turned slowly in a circle, scanning the trees, the slope of the field, the edges of the forest beyond. The land had held this secret for more than 30 years. It had waded through storms and winters. It had hidden the truth in dirt and stone. Loretta closed her eyes and tried to picture it. The night Evelyn disappeared, the rain, the lanterns, Ruth crying, Samuel burning something behind the barn, the black car parked in the woods. She imagined Evelyn walking barefoot through the trees, led by someone she trusted. She imagined her slipping through the dark toward a road where someone waited to take her away. Perhaps Ruth had watched. Perhaps she had folded the scarf as a final act of love, not a signal of surrender, but a message of protection. A way to say goodbye without saying the words aloud. Loretta opened her notebook again and drew a new line. Beneath it, she wrote one sentence. The grave was never meant to hold a body. She shared what she had found with Frank Talbot, the mechanic who had first recognized Eli Morgan. He had lived in Eminence his whole life and had known the Carters when he was a boy. He looked at the note and the dress and shook his head slowly. He said it made sense now. He had always wondered why the barn was torn down so quickly, why Samuel stopped speaking, why Ruth vanished without a trace. He said the town had chosen to forget because remembering would have meant facing something too ugly. Loretta asked him what that something was. He said people in Eminence had a way of closing their eyes to things that made them uncomfortable. He said Sheriff Halter had been respected, but also feared. He said not everything Halter did was recorded. Not every act he committed was filed. Loretta asked him if he believed Evelyn had escaped something worse than death. Frank said he did. He said she might have been the only one who got out in time. Loretta thanked him and wrote it down. One sentence. She got out. In late August of 1978, a letter arrived at the Eminence County Records Office from the Missouri Division of Vital Records in Jefferson City. The envelope was plain and unmarked except for a return address and a signature that belonged to a state archivist. Inside was a typed sheet listing the results of a DNA test that Loretta Barnes had requested 2 months earlier. She had submitted a small sample taken discreetly from the hairpin found in the hidden cellar on the Carter property. Alongside it, she had provided a sample from a distant relative of the Carter family, a cousin who had agreed to help only after learning that the investigation might prove Evelyn had lived past childhood. The test results stated that the two samples were a 99% match for a maternal line. Loretta held the document in her hands without speaking. Her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The test had confirmed that the hair found on the pin belonged to Evelyn Carter. The item had not been dropped or lost. It had been left intentionally. Someone had wanted Evelyn's mother or someone else to know she had made it to safety, even if the world assumed otherwise. Armed with the results, Loretta drove to the Public Records Office in St. Louis and requested access to old property ledgers and death certificates under the alias name Anna Ruth Whitlow. The clerk brought out several dusty volumes and rolled microfilm reels into a viewer. After several hours of reading, cross-referencing, and tracing addresses, Loretta located the final file. The name Anna Ruth Whitlow appeared on a death record dated November 4, 1976. The listed cause of death was injuries sustained in a residential house fire. The location was a 3-story boarding house in the Benton Park neighborhood of St. Louis. The fire had started in the kitchen and spread through the old wiring in the walls. 5 tenants had perished. Loretta requested this fire department's incident report and found that one of the victims had matched the physical description and age Evelyn would have been at the time. No next of kin had ever come forward. No funeral had been held. The woman had been buried in a shared plot under a name no one had recognized. There had been no obituary. The final chapter of Evelyn's life had ended without even a whisper. Loretta stood at the edge of that burial site several days later with the autumn wind moving gently across the grass. The grave marker was a plain stone with the letters ARW etched at the top and no dates below it. She carried the hairpin in her coat pocket and the photo from 1958 folded in an envelope pressed against her chest. No one else came to the cemetery. No one else seemed to remember or had known she was buried there. Loretta knelt and placed the photo in the grass, then reached into the earth and pressed the hairpin down beside it. She whispered Evelyn's name and stood quietly with her hands folded, letting the silence speak where words could not. Evelyn had lived. She had changed her name. She had escaped something dark. She had died alone. But she had not vanished. The truth had waited buried beneath lies and silence, and now it had risen into the light. Loretta did not cry. Instead, she closed her eyes and thanked her for surviving as long as she had. She said goodbye to the girl no one had fought for when it mattered, and promised her that her story would not be forgotten again. A week later, Loretta published a written report in the local paper outlining everything she had discovered. She listed the scarf, the drawings, the locket, the letters, the false grave, the DNA, and the burial under the alias name. She included the timeline from Evelyn's disappearance to the day her final resting place had been found. She did not accuse anyone directly, but she let the facts speak for themselves. She referenced the sheriff's early closure of the case, the silence of the neighbors, and the patterns of overlooked evidence. The story spread quickly, reaching nearby counties and even a regional news station. People called the school to ask if the story was true. Some brought flowers to the edge of the old orchard and left them near the foundation stones. One man came and planted a small white dogwood tree beside the site where the false grave had been discovered. A child's wind chime was tied to one of its limbs, and it rang softly whenever the wind passed. For the first time since 1945, Evelyn's name was spoken aloud in public with something other than confusion or pity. It was spoken with quiet reverence. Frank Talbot visited Loretta at the school the following month and thanked her for not letting the story fade again. He said he had lived too long with the weight of a mystery no one wanted to solve. He told her that what she had done mattered. Loretta smiled and told him it was not her story. It had always belonged to the girl who left a scarf behind and walked into the trees with courage no child should have needed. That evening, Loretta sat on her porch with the last of the sun warming her face. She thought about Ruth Carter, about the choice no mother should have had to make. She thought about Samuel, about the secrets men bury when they are afraid. And she thought about Evelyn, a child who became a ghost, then a memory, and finally a truth. The wind carried the scent of apples from the last trees still blooming in the distance. The past had spoken. The silence had broken. The orchard would never be quiet again. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe for more mysteries grounded in truth and emotion. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened to Evelyn and where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts keep the conversation alive.